Good evening, welcome. My name is Vice Principal Jeff Haywood. I'm very pleased to be your host this evening for Professor James Loxley's inaugural lecture. And while James wires himself up discreetly behind me, James grew up in North London, southeast Essex, and then headed north, and as you can tell, that was a good move from my accent, headed north and enjoyed 3 great years as a student in English language and literature at the University of Manchester. And then on graduation, returned back to London to study for his PhD at the Royal Holloway and Bedford New College. He then came north again, so he has this love-hate relationship with the south and the north. He came north again to the University of Leeds, where he had a British Academy postdoctoral fellowship before being appointed to a lectureship in English literature in Edinburgh, at the University of Edinburgh, in 1997. He was then promoted to senior lecturer in 2004 before taking up his personal chair in early modern literature in 2002. James's research interests have focused on 2012. Sorry. Yeah, I know. It's a long day.
I travel in time.
We shall. James's research interests are focused on literature in the 17th century. His first book, a study of royalist poetry in the Wars of the Kingdoms, and then on other writers such as Andrew Marvell, John Milton, and Thomas Hobbes. He says he long had an interest in the writing of Ben Jonson, and he was fortunate a few years ago to make a significant archival discovery that related to Jonson's celebrated walk from London to Edinburgh in the summer of 1618. His engagement with the writers has always been inflected by a more general theoretical interest in the literary work as a political act, which has led him into concepts of performative language and performativity broadly. His developing interest in literature and place contributed to a collaborative project with specialists in data mining and visualization and geolocation to map the distinctive literary landscape of Edinburgh. In his spare time, he enjoys the company of family and friends, and I see that some of them are here tonight, walking up and down small hills, cooking proper beer, which I suspect we will not get at the reception afterwards, very sadly, theatre and castles. So I now like to invite Professor James Loxley to give us his inaugural lecture, Ben Jonson's Road North.
Thank you.
James.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, Jeff. That's wonderful. And yes, north-south journeys, and indeed the reverse, are part of what I want to try and talk about today. Before I get there, I'd like to add some thanks of my own, if I can, to Jeff's introduction. I'm particularly grateful for the support and love that I've had from my family over the years, and I'm delighted that my mother, my wife, my 2 children, and my parents-in-law are here this evening. I regret the fact that my father is unfortunately not quite well enough to make it, but I gather this is being recorded, and hopefully he'll be able to see it later online. If so, hello, Dad. I also want to acknowledge at the outset that the paper that you're going to hear today, the talk I'm going to give today, draws substantially on research undertaken collaboratively, myself working very closely with Dr. Anna Groundwater, who I see also here today, and it would not do at all were I to embark on this without acknowledging Anna's hugely important contribution to this project. I'm also grateful to Julie Sanders at the University of Nottingham, but now out in China for a few years, for her involvement in the project as well, which was enormously valuable and certainly helped to keep us on the right path. And paths, right paths and wrong paths, is perhaps what I want to try and focus on today. In the summer of 1618, as many of you will have heard me talk about before, Ben Jonson went for a walk, a long walk, all the way from London to Edinburgh. And one of the peculiarities of our knowledge of this strange event that happened that summer is that it's, the record of it and, as it were, the kind of custodianship of it has for a long time been a peculiar Edinburgh preserve, shall we say. The most notable document to emerge from that event was a record of Jonson's conversation that he had with William Drummond of Hawthornden in the winter of 1618 into 1619, which for a long time was known as the Conversations, but it's now known as the Informations, because it's all rather one-sided. It's just what Ben Jonson thought about stuff. Drummond didn't bother to write down what he thought about stuff. He may not have been able to get a word in edgeways, who knows. So Drummond started that, and Drummond, of course, was an alumnus of this university and a benefactor. And I have a picture of him there on the left, looking rather fine. On the right-hand side, you can see another of the Edinburgh figures who is responsible for keeping the story of this journey alive. But before we get to him, I need to mention someone else, who is the antiquary Sir Robert Sibbald, who at the end of the 17th century, another alumnus of Edinburgh University, at the end of the 17th century, made an invaluable transcription of Drummond's Informations, which was preserved and then eventually came into the library of the Faculty of Advocates and was there uncovered by yet another Edinburgh figure, the man you can see on the right there, David Lang, who left his own substantial manuscript collection to this university. So that transcription, the Sibbald transcription that Lang rediscovered in the 19th century, is the fullest and we think most accurate version of Drummond's Informations. Another version of that was published in the early 18th century in a collection of Drummond's works, and that's something I'm emphasising now because I'm going to come back to it towards the end. The story doesn't stop there, though, because further information on Jonson's stay in Edinburgh was uncovered by David Masson, who, it will not surprise you to learn, was a professor at this university, and uncovered this information in the city archives, information relating to the hospitality that Jonson received during his stay, in particular the Burgess dinner that was held for him and the cost of that, and the making and gilding of his Burgess ticket, because he was made an honorary Burgess of the city of Edinburgh. And the story doesn't even stop there, because I think about 22 years ago or thereabouts, a far better Johnsonian than I am, Ian Donaldson, stood in a lecture theatre somewhere in these parts and delivered a lecture on Ben Jonson's walk to Scotland, which was the first thing that I ever read about this particular topic, and which provoked my interest and which was very much influential on my own a sense of what this walk had been. I should also mention, honourable mention for another Edinburgh resident, though not an Edinburgh University connection, James Knowles, who published an article 6 or 7 years ago which further fleshed out the picture of Ben Jonson's walk. And there the matter rested until, as Jeff said, I was lucky enough 5 years ago now, through a chance encounter with a catalogue entry, to come across a 32-leaf manuscript, which looks like that. Rather unimpressive looking thing. It's not that big in real life. It's actually considerably smaller than that. But it is nonetheless a 32-leaf manuscript, which contains an account of the walk entitled My Gossip Jonson, His Foot Voyage and Mine into Scotland, written by an unknown and indeed, alas, still unidentified travelling companion. And it includes a detailed account of Jonson's walk from his departure from Bishopsgate in London, which you can see there, I'll point it out in a second, on the 8th of July, and continues until 9 days after his formal entry into Edinburgh on Friday the 18th of September. Bishopsgate is roughly here. You can see Bishopsgate, that looks rather fine. This is actually a map from 1559, 1560, so it would have changed a little bit. But what's good about this one is a lot of the kind of incidental detail, such as people doing their washing that you can see there. Something, actually, I was talking to my father-in-law, Reg, about this only a few days ago, trying to work out what exactly this was. So if anyone does know, do tell us. And also this place here, which I rather like, which is the doghouse, which is where I will be if I spend far too long on incidental detail in the illustrations on my slides. So that's what I was lucky enough to uncover then, this account, 7,000, 8,000 word account, which also included some peculiar extra passages tacked on at the end, a few fragments of what people had, of conversational sayings that people had uttered, some information on York, which had been sort of gathered up at some point and yet not incorporated into the full narrative, and another even weirder thing, which again I will come on to in due course. Now then, the provenance of this manuscript is a question that we wanted to ask. What on earth was it doing where we found it, where I found it? I found it in a collection of family papers belonging to the Aldersey family of Chester, who were a kind of landed gentry family who prospered in law, in county offices in Cheshire, and indeed in mercantile activity in London during the 16th century, or began to do particularly well in the 16th century and carried on doing well until the 20th, I suppose, and but now their large house is all gone. And their papers are all deposited in the record office in Chester. No known connection to Jonson, as far as we could see. No suggestion of any kind of connection at all, though we have been able to trace lines of connection between Jonson's circle and that milieu in and around Chester at the time, so we can sort of point to possible ways in which this thing might have come into the possession of this family, which otherwise seems a little obscure and opaque. We're fairly clear from some incidental detail in the manuscript that it dates to between 1620 and 1628, but it is, however, a fair copy. It's not an autograph written by the actual traveller, we don't think, unless he was a professional scribe. It's a fair copy, and it's made from at least, I mean, there must be at least one version of it behind it, because it's edited at some points. There are kind of abbreviations and other things where material has been elided. So the provenance of it is a bit of a puzzle for us. There is a possibility, no more than that, a possibility that the scribe who wrote this had previously done work for Jonson. What you can see on the left is a page from a scribal manuscript in the Royal, well, it was in the Royal Collection, it's now in the British Library, of Jonson's Mask of Blackness, and that's a very fair copy being done for presentation to royalty. On the right-hand side, you can see a page from the Foot Voyage. I've had a few arguments with people about whether or not there is any kind of connection between these two hands. Really difficult to prove decisively, the particular problem being that they're done for very different occasions and done at least 20 years, well, probably as much as 20 years apart. So there is a chance that this is something that emerges, that this copy emerges from a pen that was known to Jonson, but we can't be, I wouldn't want to say it any stronger than that. Nonetheless, what the account reveals to us is substantial. We get a precise itinerary for the walk itself, and we get information on exactly how he travelled, which is on foot all the way, where he took particular detours to visit the houses of particular patrons, and indeed the nature of the kind of welcome that he received on his travels. And in some ways that's one of the most striking elements of this. This is an account of their welcome into Pontefract in West Yorkshire. And it says, we lay at Mr. Tatum's, an alderman, to whose house we came the back way, because all the town was up in throngs to see us. And there was dancing of giants, and music prepared to meet us. And notwithstanding we took a byway to escape the crowd and staring of the people, yet a swarm of boys and others crossed over to overtake us, and pressed so upon us that we were fain to present our pistols upon them, to keep them back, and made them believe we would shoot them to get passage. So we've got some kind of sort of fan culture gathering around Ben Jonson, a celebrity policing issue, public order issue arising as a result of his arrival here in Pontefract, and there are this practice of dancing giants. This is a couple of dancing giants from Belgium, where these processional giants are still used in civic festivities, and it may be that what we had in Pontefract then was an instance or example of that. The next day in Pontefract, just to give you another kind of sense of the flavour of what they were doing, they went to visit this place, which is Pontefract Castle, painted in about 1639-40, and which only looked like that for another 4 years or so before being completely and summarily flattened during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms. And the account says of that, the next day we visited the castle, and whatsoever tasted of antiquity in the town, there we saw the chamber where Richard III was murdered, and where H. the Eighth was seized by Culpeper. It's not Richard III, it's Richard II, though there is a Richard III connection to Pontefract Castle, so our writer is getting a little bit muddled there. And H. the Eighth is, of course, Henry VIII, and being C means being cuckolded by Culpeper in a notorious incident from Henry's reign. So that gives us some sense both of the sort of public welcome that they were receiving along the way, and some sense too of the kinds of investments that travellers themselves had in what they were doing. That sense of trying to pass through a significant landscape, a landscape marked by particular histories that you would then try and tap into through trying to pick up the taste of antiquity in that way. And that raises the question for us, which is my next question I want to dwell on for a little bit, of what Jonson thought he was doing when he set off on his walk. Why did he go? What did he do it for? There are, I think, a few relevant comparators that we can bring into play here. The first of these would be King James's own journey from London to Edinburgh the previous year in 1617. And it's perhaps notable that the first mention of Jonson's plan to do the walk dates from June 1617, which is exactly the point when reports of what people were encountering who had gone with James on his progress and had now arrived in Scotland, exactly the kind of reports of the welcome that they received and the entertainment that had been staged for them and all the rest of it. So this was of topical interest in the summer of 1617, and just at the point when that news is reaching London, Jonson's plan becomes public knowledge. So it's possible that he's following in the footsteps of King James in that sense. But there are other comparators too, which we also ought to bring into play, particularly noting the public nature of the enterprise, and which is revealed in the extract I've read to you already. A couple of instances which I'll focus on. The first is the penniless pilgrimage undertaken by John Taylor, which was actually a walk, again, from London to Edinburgh, undertaken that very same summer. He set off 6 days after Jonson, we now know, and he went a different route. He went up the northwest, so not the A1, but the A6, and arrived sometime before, and then had a tour into the Highlands and the rest of it. So, but his motive, or his what he was doing was very much a kind of public journey, a journey with a particular sort of quirk to it. In his instance, that he was going without money. He wasn't going to spend any money. He was going to rely on the hospitality of strangers, which was an important social virtue for the early moderns. So Taylor was in some ways testing the capacity of the hospitality of the realm, the realms indeed, to support him on his travels. But he was also doing it to write an account of it and to give a copy of that account to people who had subscribed money to support him in his endeavours. So it was a kind of subscription journey in some ways. It may also have been, and this is where it gets a bit hazy, a wager journey. The kind of journey which he would lay out money on his embarkation against him actually completing the journey successfully. If he completed it successfully, then those to whom he'd laid out money would have to pay him lots more in return, essentially, so that he'd gain from doing that. And they would gain if he either failed to meet the particular condition, i.e. managing to do it without spending any money, or died along the way. So there's that sense of a kind of journey done as a sort of little economic enterprise of itself, as a kind of performance enterprise in itself. There's also another kind of model for this, which was indeed a kind of wage journey of sorts, which is the guy you can see up on the left with his tabouret and the man dancing. That is Will Kemp, the Shakespearean clown, who undertook a 9 days Morris in the summer of 1600 from London to Norwich and danced all the way, not every day, but he danced in sort of stages all along the way, with a guy along to keep a note of what he was actually doing and someone to beat out the rhythm so that he had something to dance to. And again, that account, which he immediately wrote up and published, is full of all sorts of details of the kinds of welcome that he had along the way and the crowds that greeted him and so on and so forth. So Jonson's journey was not entirely unprecedented as a kind of enterprise, and there are these different kinds of analogues or connections that we might see in it. There's some evidence for it being a kind of wager journey or a particular feat that he was seeking to accomplish, and we see that in his welcome into Edinburgh, where he is, where there's a kind of ceremonial acknowledgement of his completion of the journey at the Market Cross on the High Street. Which, and again, this kind of gives detail of the sorts of crowds that greeted him and how they were, they being so thick in the street that we could scarce pass by them. Kemp records the same sort of things in his account as well. Now, beyond such questions of motive, though, there is the issue of meaning. As Robert Macfarlane has noted, the literature of wayfaring is long, existing as poems, songs, stories, treatises and route guides, maps, novels and essays. The compact between writing and walking is almost as old as literature. A walk is only a step away from a story, and every path tells. At the same time, to narrate the progress of these summer months is to engage in what Macfarlane, drawing on Walter Benjamin, calls biogeography, as if setting out the sphere of life, bios, graphically on a map. So in the spirit of that, I want to ask, what story does Jonson's walk between the cities of London and Edinburgh tell? How might the significance of such a line traced through the varying landscapes of England and lowland Scotland, diverging from and converging with the route of the Great North Road, be understood? If he sought such understanding, Jonson undoubtedly drew on the series of antiquarian and chorographical writers whose accounts of the kingdoms were published in the decades prior to 1618. And by chorographical, I'm invoking a particularly kind of early modern genre of writing about place, which married historical detail and kind of description of landscape and industry and so on and so forth. Now, there are several kinds of things, exemplars that we could reference, and I'll just mention those very briefly. On the left, you can see an illustration from William Camden's Britannia, which was first published in 1586 and steadily grew in editions before being published in the English translation in 1610. It was called Britannia, and it did aspire to include not just England, but the other nations of the archipelago. That ambition was pretty sort of rudimentary in the early editions, but the detail on Scotland in particular got a bit bigger and bigger, certainly after the union of the crowns in 1603. Another instance would be William Harrison's descriptions of England, Scotland and Ireland, which are included with Holinshed's Chronicles, and the one on the right here as well, which is John Speed's Theatre of the Whole Island of Great Britain, which has a grand series of maps and which appeared in 1612, the same year as the first part of Michael Drayton's grand chorographical poem, Polly Albion, and the title itself tells you something, which itself drew heavily on Camden and also featured a commentary by Jonson's friend, John Selden. Now, all of these works had, in some senses, as I suggested, been shaped first by the prospect and then by the reality of the Stuart succession. And taking the fact of a rearranged Britain on board sometimes required more than the expansion, augmentation, or conjunction of current cartographies. The journey north in English culture had long implied a close encounter with a particular set of symbolic qualities, and none of them positive. Out of the north all ill comes forth, as the old proverb had it, like the chill north wind itself. And one instance of that would be Richard Eades's account of his 1584 journey to Durham, which he called an iter boreale, a journey northwards, in which the north was characterised, as Eades's modern editor puts it, as remote, exotic and rather forbidding. Now, Jonson's friend Richard Corbett in the 1620s undertook his own iter boreale, though being a classic southerner, he went no further than Newark upon Trent, that is, but still counted it a journey north. Well, there you go. A more notorious mobilisation of the similar tropes is the description of the people and country of Scotland, apparently the result of an English courtier's encounter with James's northern realm during the king's return home in 1617. This sneering account of Scottish backwardness, barbarism and barrenness made full use of the set of customary southern slurs. It survives in a substantial number of manuscript copies and seems to have found an eager English readership. Interestingly, the earliest surviving printed text of the description, an unsurprisingly unlicensed 4th edition of 1626, is attributed on its title page to Dr. Corbett. It's as if the Iter Boreali genre has allowed this kind of cross-border conflation of very, very different journeys to come about. From the last years of Elizabeth's reign, however, the sharpening prospect of the English and Scottish monarchies conjoining in a Stuart had suggested to some a need for adjustments to the standard picture. In an epigram evidently written during the political squalor which characterised the demise of the Tudor dynasty, Sir John Harrington offered some coded, though hardly veiled, counsel to the Earl of Essex, who had disobeyed his ruler. But this is the epigram that he writes. Great Essex now of late incurred hath his mistress' indignation and her wrath, and that in him she chiefly disalloweth. She sent him north, he bent him to the south. Then what shall Essex do? Let him henceforth bend all his wits, his power and courage north. And by north, Harrington clearly means King James. When James's succession to the English throne came, James himself wasted no time in rearranging the topography of his realms, insisting that the former border counties would now become the Middle Shires. And others, too, recognised the change that this accession had brought about. There's a rather cute volume of poems called Northern Poems, published in 1604, which is a volume of kind of panegyrics to the new Stuart dynasty that has taken over. And the author is struggling to kind of adjust the topography. He says, all evil from the north, saith proverb old, but we may say the north sends us most good. It's not very good, I have to say, but nonetheless. Our gracious king, with offspring manifold, from thence derives his stock and royal blood. Let Boreas blast to others evil bring, all good to us that sends us such a king. So the north is kind of, the whole thing is completely reversed, and the north now becomes the source of plenty and goodness in a way that it hasn't normally been. Nonetheless, in another poem, this writer casts himself as, and casts his poems rather, as the unpolished verses of a rural muse from north's cold climes. So for this writer, it seems, James's accession had more likely set the symbolic compass spinning. Now, both the union of the crowns and James's consequent pursuit of fuller constitutional union have been the focus of ample scholarly attention in recent decades. I'm very aware that Jenny Wernimold is here now, who has written very illuminatingly on this topic, so I'm going to tread slightly carefully, I hope. The stalling of James's grander plans, largely the result of alarmed opposition in the English Parliament, though there were weighty reservations in Scotland too, didn't mean the end of the project. The verdict in what was known as Calvin's case, which confirmed the naturalisation in England of Scots born after the king's accession to his later throne, conceded the fundamental constitutional importance for the southern realm of the coincidence of the two monarchies in James's person. And while the king, here he is, towering over London, and while the king had tried to tempt his English subjects by talking of the projected union as a conquest of Scotland, though wrought by love rather than war, he insisted, in a well-known speech to the Westminster Parliament in March 1607, they chose not to believe him. This was perhaps in part because the kind of union he created in the organisation of his court, in the distribution of power and favour, and in his emphasis on aristocratic Scoto-English marriages, spoke not of English dominance, or even of an indifferent or transcendent Britishness, but rather of the balancing of equally audible national claims. Such moves confounded both the English national self-image encouraged by his Tudor predecessors and the hopes for preferment, more materially, of many aspirant English nobles and gentlemen. Some of the dismayed or disgruntled responded with violent xenophobia, and Jonson himself was caught up in an incident no doubt arising from inflamed national sensitivities in 1605, when he was imprisoned for writing something against the Scots, as Drummond put it, in the play Eastward Ho, though Jonson, as he would, disclaimed any responsibility for the offending passages. He said they were the fault of his co-author. He may have been telling the truth. Now, Jonson himself, his own sense of himself is altered and changed by that Jacobean succession. He rediscovers his Scots roots from Annandale, he says. In his masques, he assists in crafting a symbolic language of British union, which furnished the Jacobean conjunction with its necessary metaphysics. He received a pension as well in 1616 from the court, so he became a kind of salaried court poet to that extent. and was sufficiently recognised as a court fixture to receive an allowance for mourning cloth at James's demise in 1625. And you can see Benjamin Jonson here receiving 7 yards for himself and 4 yards for a servant, among a kind of motley crew of people who don't have any sort of proper place in the institutions, but are nonetheless important enough to be included among the list of those getting cloth for the occasion. The keeper of the muskmellions, which is sort of muskmelons, which is melons. I didn't know they needed keeping, but anyway, perhaps they're kind of wild. They roam about the place. You've got to keep them in check. But James was only the keystone of a protective arch of Scottish friends and patrons. Among these, we have Esme Stuart, Lord d'Aubigny. Jonson said that he lived in his house for 5 years, so he was kind of among the household of Lord d'Aubigny. And he dedicated his place Sir Janus to him in the folio of 1616. D'Aubigny was the brother of, and indeed the successor, to Ludovic Stuart, Earl of Richmond and Duke of Lennox, who were both, and they were both gentlemen of the bedchamber and among the most influential of courtiers. And this is Ludovic Stuart over here, looking rather fine. As well as that, though, we find Jonson seeking and gaining the patronage, it seems, of a man called Sir Francis Stuart, to whom the play Epicene was dedicated in the 1616 folio, and Francis Stuart was the king's cousin. So this is another kind of high-ranking figure. And travelling up the North Road in the summer of 1618, Jonson is threading his way along an umbilical route of which the Scots of James's court were now regular denizens, like high-status itinerants of a sort. We find him encountering Scots courtiers at Newark, at Doncaster, at York, at Newcastle. And indeed, when he comes into Scotland, when he crosses the border, we find him hosted by a range of Scots with courtly connections. Among them, prominent among them, the Auchmuty brothers, who sound like a kind of music hall act from the early 20th century, but were in fact a kind of prominent group of courtiers, headed by a man called John Auchmuty, who was a groom of the bedchamber, if I'm remembering correctly, and also master of the King's wardrobe. Is that right, Anna? He was master of the wardrobe in Scotland, wasn't he? I think so, definitely. Yes. So, we also find him at North Berwick, being escorted by another groom of the bedchamber, who was a kinsman, possibly brother, to John Ramsay, who was the Viscount Haddington, for whose wedding in 1608 Jonson had written a masque. And we also find him being hosted at Dunfermline by a man called John Gibb, one of James's most long-standing courtiers. At Leith, we find him breaking bread with a man called Robert Hay, who was brother to James Lord Hay, this somewhat stern-looking fellow over here with the nice legs. Are they nice legs? Jacobean terms, those are nice legs. Who was the patron for Jonson's masque Lovers Made Men. Also in Leith, we've long known, because John Taylor wrote about it in his Penniless Pilgrimage, that Jonson stayed with a man called Mr. John Stuart, Master John Stuart, who Masson identified as the water bailey, a kind of civic official of the port, but the detail in the manuscript has allowed us to identify him instead as another of the king's cousins, in fact the younger son of the disgraced Earl of Bothwell. Given such presences, the Scotland into which Jonson travelled in the summer of 1618 would have been anything but a land of strangers, very far from remote, hardly exotic, and not at all forbidding. And we can see this in the kind of border ceremony, the crossing the border ceremony that the account gives some kind of detail of. That's where they cross the border. That's just off the A1 in Northumberland. That's the old route north that you can see going from left to right, and that's the border wall. So that's where it would have happened. And we get an account of a little ceremony that took place there, which you can read down the bottom there, where they're escorted out of Berwick by the man who'd been the commander of the garrison at Berwick. And there's a glass of wine and some weeping as well, some tears from Sir William Bowyer, who was sorry to see Jonson go. But the account itself doesn't seem to register some kind of dramatic change in landscape or anything else as you move from England into Scotland. It notes the details of the ceremony, but is seemingly unmoved by the transition from one kingdom to another. Now, the walkers' itinerary took them through the rural plenitude of the Lothians to be entertained by dancing shearers near North Berwick, and accompanied between the splendour of Seaton Palace, which is this place here that you can see, now long gone, and the town of Preston by, as the account puts it, 2 earls. George Seaton, 3rd Earl of Winton, and Francis Stuart, who was the elder brother of the John Stuart with whom Jonson stayed in Leith. And the man on the left here is the 3rd Earl of Winton with some fetching children. I should actually say, because I should have said at the beginning, children. I should have said at the beginning, because you're going to get very bored, and you're probably already really, really bored, I've got a couple of pictures in here for you, and your job is to spot them when they come up. Okay? Good. So, yes, 3rd Earl of Winton. Where was I? Yes, that's right. And what we have in the account as well is detail on the welcome at Edinburgh, which is even the day before Jonson's formal entry, it speaks of the kind of warmth of reception that he's getting. It says the women in throngs ran to see us. When we put that on Twitter, someone thought it said women in thongs, and that would have been completely the wrong impression. The women in throngs ran to see us, etc., some bringing sack and sugar, others aqua vitae and sugar. Jonson's subsequent stay in the city was to provoke his description of it as the heart of Scotland, Britain's other eye, a bright place, an intellectual centre. What followed immediately on his arrival is equally notable. He was taken across the Forth to be shown George Bruce's extraordinary undersea coal mine at Coorus. And that's George Bruce there, George Bruce of Carnock, looking rather severe, certainly more severe than the Earl of Winton, but there you go. To see his extraordinary undersea coal mine at Coorus. And I have here a picture, I think. Yes, there's a picture of Coorus from rather later in the 17th century. The visual evidence of the coal mine is hard to come by. There's not a lot of it left. It was washed away in the 1620s in a big storm. But I've got what I think is a kind of reconstruction of one of the pathways in the tunnel. Are we getting somewhere? Yes? Yes, we might be. Okay, anyway, there's one of the tunnels in the mine, I think. So yes, went to see his coal mines and his coal mine and his extensive salt pans, adding sort of information of industrial wealth and productivity to the kind of image of plenitude and wealth that his trip into Scotland had already shown him. Thence to Dunfermline, the Queen's town, and that's the western approach into Dunfermline, where the welcoming party was led by Alexander Seaton, Earl of Dunfermline and Lord Chancellor, who, in his biographer's words, was a great humanist in prose and poesy, Greek and Latin, well versed in the mathematics, and had great skill in architecture and heraldry. And that's him over here on the left. Also greeting him there was his wife, Margaret Hay. This is actually a pair of paintings. The colour on the one on the right is all wrong, but it's the best high-quality image I could find. But this is a pair of paintings of those that were done. The interesting detail in the account is it records that when they met the Countess, she was, as it says, shooting at butts. She was practising archery. And I wish I had a picture of her practising archery. Unfortunately, I don't, but I do have a picture of another Scottish noblewoman practising archery. So, Dunfermline, the Earl of Dunfermline, was also the builder of a Renaissance villa, Pinkie House at Musselburgh, in whose emblematic decorative scheme Jonson appears to have taken a keen interest, and you can see that there. It's now in a school, Loretto School in Musselburgh. All along this Scottish route, the account keeps careful note of the grand houses and castles seen along the way, or those owned by people about whom they're learning, insofar as it bespeaks the distinctively Jacobean landscape of these years, evident in the apparent prosperity of those on whom the regal sun shone so favourably. The foot voyage might be seen to participate in the reordering of the proverbial British topography of northern deprivation and southern abundance. So the walk itself makes sense as a Jacobean enterprise. It reflects the kind of transformations in topography, or at least for some at any rate, the transformations in topography that the Jacobean era had brought about, that conjunction from 1603 onwards. And indeed it is in some ways presided over by the shadowy presence of King James himself. When Jonson entered Edinburgh, he would have done so through the Netherbow Porch. There's a statue of King James over the Netherbow Porch, which had been put there in 1615. He would have gone up to the castle. We know he went up to the castle because it says so in the account. What it doesn't say is that that he saw this room. I'm sure he did. This was the chamber in which James was born, and it had been decorated in the scheme that you can see there now and still see today up the road in 1617, specifically decorated for James's return when he came back on his royal progress. Jonson also visited and showed an interest in the Tombs College, which is us which is this place here, as it was slightly idealised from slightly later in the 17th century. And we see it also in the healths drunk along the way. They drink the health of the king on a number of notable occasions. Most interestingly, they do it at Welbeck Abbey, where Jonson's staying, at Jonson's insistence, and the day they do it on is Gowrie Day. It's the day of the anniversary of the plot against King James. So Jonson is definitely enacting Jacobean festivity in his walk. Yet it can be argued that this insistently Jacobean journey was also shaped by the tensions and friction of the binational proximity that James's double reign had brought about. Such friction could be found in the chorographic inscription of the landscape and history of a renewed Britain, despite the apparently generous inclusiveness of the 1607 edition, in particular of Camden's Britannia, and indeed Speed's Theatre of the Empire of Great Britain. The Britain visible in such works was usually Anglo-centric. Scotland was either marginalised or reduced in historical stature relative to its southern neighbour. So Scottish historians and chorographers tended to be overlooked or in some cases attacked. William Harrison had a good go at Hector Boyce for his account of Scottish origins, Scottish history, and George Buchanan's great historical work, Rerum Scoticarum Historia, was taken to task by Camden. Why did this matter? Why was that in any way important? It's important because such histories of Britain downplayed or contradicted Scottish political genealogies, specifically genealogies which stressed the longevity and continuity of a Scottish realm, going back, they said, to a mythical King Fergus I. They didn't say it was mythical necessarily, which were important because such histories were crucial in the Scottish resistance to English claims to suzerainty, to kind of feudal dominance over Scotland. English claims to such suzerainty had long been made. They were made as recently as the 1540s in what's known as the Rough Wooing. They were made also and relied upon by Edward I in his claims to dominance over Scotland. And those claims, they based their idea of Britain as an English imperium, at least in part, on the mythic narrative of British origins advanced by Geoffrey of Monmouth and his followers, according to which the Trojan Brutus had been the original possessor of the whole island. And divided it between his three sons, giving the realm now transformed into England to the eldest, thus establishing ab initio the dependent character of any Scottish kingdom. This narrative was itself sceptically handled by the historian Polydore Virgil in the mid-16th century, and then indeed handled with tongs, at least, by Camden, but was also given a new lease of life by the Welsh antiquary Humphrey Lloyd in his Breviary of Britain, which was first published in Latin in 1572. Lloyd had been scathing about the alternative narrative of Scottish origins presented by Boyce. Buchanan, in turn, vehemently criticised Lloyd's account in his Historia. And if that all sounds incredibly abstruse and distant and strange and obscure, I would just mention as an aside, when David Cameron was love-bombing us a couple of weeks ago with his speech, he made reference to a book called Our Island Story, which is supposedly a kind of the grand narrative of British history around which we can all mobilise. What he didn't say is that used to be, although it's now been republished by a right-wing think tank as Our Island Story, A History of Britain, it was always known for a long time as Our Island Story, A History of England, and what's more, in its first chapter, it details the story of Brutus. So this stuff hasn't gone away. It's still lurking there. Interestingly enough, the author of that, Henrietta Marshall, also wrote a book called The Story of Scotland, which begins with the alternative Scottish origin myth, not of a Trojan but of a Greek, Gathalus, instead. That's an aside, but nonetheless, just to show I'm not entirely disappeared into an era distant from our own. There's ample evidence to indicate that Jonson, as well as his Scottish hosts, would have been sensitive to these conflicts over British histories. Despite his difficulties over Eastward Hoe, Jonson's own deployments of such narratives had often shown an unusual degree of national tact, at least as far as Scotland was concerned, specifically as far as Scotland was concerned, certainly not as far as Wales or Ireland were concerned. In his contribution to the coronation entertainment of 1604, for example, he coupled his portrayal of London as the new Troy, founded by Brutus, and the empire's seat, with an insistence that neither the Briton stroke, by which he means the rule, government, nor the Roman, Saxon, Dane and Norman yoke could bring about what this point of time, or to put it another way, a Scottish king, had accomplished, presenting the Jacobean Union not as the restoration of an originary and implicitly English empire, but as an unprecedented, if prophesied, event. Such a way of putting it happily conceded Scotland's sovereignty its status as an unconquered realm, and made the fulfilment of the prophecy of empire a distinctively Scottish achievement. In the speeches at Prince Henry's barriers, written 6 years later, the Arthurian characters and setting, which you can see here's Merlin over here, and this is the setting. It was set in St George's portico. Those are certainly redolent of Galfredian patriotic myth, the patriotic myth derived from Geoffrey of Monmouth's stories, his Arthurian stories, as is the parade of kingly English warriors for whom the name of Britain is glibly appropriated. That one of the most prominent of these brave Briton heroes should be Edward I, Malleus Scotorum, would seem to point towards an evocation of precisely the claims of suzerainty for which Edward himself had mobilised the Brutus story. Yet the whole event is in fact presided over by the new Arthur, Prince Henry, who is named Meliadus and styled Lord of the Isles, an emphatically, if not unproblematically, Scottish title, which here grows imperially to embrace the Fortunate Isles of Britain as a whole. This gesture is coupled with a notable exclusion from the list of countries in which you may behold the conquests got, the spoils, the trophies reared by British kings. Wales is there lumped in with the Low Countries, France and Spain, while the securing of Ireland, that more entitled than in fact before was conquered, is attributed to royal and mighty James himself. The inclusion of Wales, conquered by Edward I, serves to stress the ultimate failure of Plantagenet designs on the kingdom omitted from Jonson's list, and therefore once again to acknowledge Scotland's own independence, even while rehearsing the English imperial theme. Such British concerns appear again in a different key in Jonson's anti-masque for the Honour of Wales, which was performed at court only 5 months before he set out on his walk. This featured a trio of Welsh characters who petitioned James to honour Wales with the kind of visit he'd just paid to Scotland, but whose assertion of Welsh honour is rendered in a distinctly comic register. Here, the retelling of British myth modulates into the character's search for securely Welsh roots, even for the names of Scottish courtiers such as John Auchmuty, him again, and Sir Robert Carr. Such an exaggerated insistence on the Welsh origins of Britain parodied the claims of the Galfredian antiquarianism associated with Humphrey Lloyd. In this context, it is notable that the Welsh attorney of Jonson's anti-masque opens his song with the line, "I's not come here to talk of brute," while nonetheless reminding his audience that the long pedigree of Prince Camber, Brutus's third son, legendary first ruler of Wales, would fill all this chamber. So when he does stage the Geoffrey of Monmouth, the kind of mythic material, Jonson does it in a slightly comic register, as if to kind of register his difference and his distance from the sorts of claims that are there encoded. And we actually have a kind of Scottish twist to this game of etymological trumps that the Welsh characters launch, trying to trace everything back to roots in Wales. At the anti-masque's conclusion, the three protagonists turn to consider His Majesty's anagrams of Charles James Stuart. It's got a comic Welsh accent in it, and I'm not going to even attempt to do it, so that'd just be wrong. Charles James Stuart, anagrams thereof, that's the king's full name. The first such anagram to be aired is said in the masque to refer to Cadir Arthur, Arthur's chair, a site of mythic importance in Brecknockshire, mentioned by Camden, and to which one of the Welsh protagonists has already referred. Yet the anagram itself is constrained to say something slightly different, and in doing so to point elsewhere. James, it suggests, claims Arthur's seat. Now, what I don't need to tell you, of course, is that Arthur's seat is a rather big hill just down the road, which had for a long time been stood at the centre of a royal hunting park. And it was a kind of hugely important element in the kind of topographical imagination of Edinburgh. We find a topographical poem by the humanist scholar and Neo-Latin poet John Johnston, which was included by Camden in his 1607 Britannia, showing Arthur's seat presiding over a locus of wonder, which is emphatically a royal and national capital. And in that sort of prospect, you can see quite how prominent it could look. These are from the Blaau Atlas of Scotland, published in the 1650s. So, there's a kind of twist then. The anagram is said to speak of James as claiming Arthur's seat, or everything that the Welsh characters have tried to do is to trace everything back to Welsh origins. What that does is suddenly provide an alternative Scottish location for that particular claim. So the unitary story of the story of unitary British origins told by the Welsh characters in the anti-masque becomes strangely bivocal and binational. The attempt to trace Scottish names back to Welsh sources and places is thrown into reverse, and a Britannic Arthur is discerned awkwardly within the symbolically tense topography of Scotland's capital. So, There is then evidence for Jonson treating these kinds of materials, the stuff of the sort of national frictions, the friction between national mythologies, with some degree of sensitivity and understanding, and some degree of at least as far as I say, as far as Scotland is concerned, not as far as the rest of the constituent parts of the three kingdoms would be concerned. And we can see further evidence of the walker's familiarity with the stuff of Scottish chorographical and antiquarian writing if we look at some of the additional material in the manuscript. One of the things, as I mentioned before, is a rather strange piece in the manuscript, which is called Canesco, or the Slew Dog's language. And we looked at this for ages and ages and ages and couldn't make head nor tail of it for a long time. Could barely transcribe it because it wasn't written in anything like a kind of sort of standard, the standard sort of Southern English of the rest of the manuscript. It appeared to be written in a very different kind of thing and to be trying to render dialect. We eventually got a handle on it and realised that what we were looking at was something which tries to give a rendering of Slew Dog's language, which are the commands and responses that pass between a master and the species of bloodhound, a sleuth hound, on both sides of the border, but is particularly associated with Scotland. And you can see that in a lovely illustration here from Edward Topsell's Four-Legged Beasts, where you can see the sleuth hound of Scotland up the top there, and the English bloodhound down below. The sleuth hound would jump on the back of the horse and ride on the horse, and then jump down and do its pursuing. And that's confirmed actually by the account by the detail in the account. Now, the detail and the information about the sleuth hound we find primarily in Scottish sources. It's Scottish historical and chorographical sources that include this as one of the kind of distinctive features of Scottish life. Particularly associated with the borders, but always on this side of them, even though the use of the dogs was on both sides of the border. And we find that in Hector Boyce, we find that in John Leslie, the historian John Leslie, not the guy from the TV, and we also find it in an unhelpfully titled book called Certain Matters Composed Together, which I don't recommend as a book title if anyone's thinking of writing one, which was first published in 1594, but then reprinted in London in 1603 as Certain Matters Concerning the Realm of Scotland, which is slightly more descriptive of what it actually is. It has a large chunk of unattributed Buchanan in it, but also a list of Scottish wonders, including the Slew Dog, and a particular emphasis on the words of art spoken by his master in his direction of the dog. And that's exactly the focus that we find in the Foot Voyage manuscript as well, that focus on the words of art spoken by the master. And just to emphasise the Scottishness of the Slew Dog, I show you the arms of the Drummond Earls of Perth, and there, crowning that coat of arms, is a little doggy, and that is indeed a Slew Dog. So, while it would be very difficult to show that the 1618 rendering of dog's language in our own manuscript is directly shaped or focused by the emphasis of this earlier pamphlet, it's nonetheless suggestive that Jonson's companion should make a detailed record not just of a local cultural practice that featured particularly prominently in chorographies of Scotland, but of an aspect of that practice that is particularly emphasised in a work which itself draws extensively on Buchanan's contested history and description of his native land. In this connection, the fact that Jonson owned a copy of Buchanan's Rerum Scoticarum Historia and that it was a gift to him from William Drummond perhaps assumes a heightened significance. Given such context then, given all that detail, what kind of mark might any of this left on Jonson's writing? And this is the bit I'd like to end on. Jonson, in his in the notes taken by Drummond and in the subsequent correspondence between them, we get evidence of the sort of range of Jonson's interests. It's genuinely kind of heterogeneous, his interests in matters Scots. One of the things he says he's going to write is a Fisher play set in Loch Lomond, which was another Scottish natural wonder, a predominant feature of the province of Lennox, which is, of course, the part of the country from which Jonson's patrons, his Stuart patrons, the Esme Stuart, Earl of Daubigny, and indeed the Earl of Richmond, Duke of Lennox, claimed their title. He said he was going to write his foot pilgrimage hither and call it a discovery. That, alas, was lost in a fire in 1623, or else none of this would be necessary. We also have other kinds of elements of Scottish life and history that he's drawing attention to and seeking information about, including the curriculum at the University of Edinburgh. He wants to know about that as well. However, there is one other work mentioned by Drummond, but it's usually ignored because of a common editorial decision. I'm not saying it's a wrong editorial decision. I'm just going to try and give some evidence for another reading. That's Lennox. Sorry, I should have passed that. That's Loch Lomond. It's said to have a floating island that moved up and down, but nonetheless. That's by the by, I'm near the doghouse. Giving the statement pride of place at the outset of the informations, Drummond records how Jonson hath an intention to perfect an epic poem entitled Heroologia of the worthies of this country roused by fame, and was to dedicate it to his country. And you can see that up here. This is how one version of Drummond's notes gives it. In fact, the closest version we've got, which is the transcript made by Sir Robert Sibbald from the now lost original, and you can see where it says this country there. Modern editors, however, amend this to his, following the reading given in the somewhat different, abbreviated and independently derived text of the Conversations first printed in 1711. So it reads, hath an intention to perfect an epic poem of the worthies of his country, roused by fame, and was to dedicate it to his country, which makes it a strangely circular gesture. This is rather different. The kind of emendation that editors standardly go in for erases what would have been a challengingly non-Anglo-centric, indeed distinctively British in a distinctive way, gesture, a verse history of Scotland, told through the lives and deeds of its most celebrated figures, addressed to an English audience that was not always aware of, interested in, or receptive to the national claims of those peoples with whom it was required to share the archipelago. Now, there is some circumstantial evidence to suggest that this is at least a possibility worth entertaining. We know that Drummond and Jonson exchanged not just works by Buchanan, but also works by John Johnston, who'd written that topographical poem on Edinburgh that I mentioned earlier, including John Johnson's Inscriptiones Historicae, which is a kind of long epigrammatic history, if you can have such a thing, a history in epigrams of the kings of Scotland right the way back to Fergus I, and with which actually included a version of the myth of Gathalus written by Andrew Melville. So this is, in some ways, this is very unlikely material to be for Jonson to be drawing on, because it's coming from a tradition, a political tradition, which James himself was sort of strongly opposed to. But nonetheless, we can see here Jonson's motto, Tanquam Explorator, and there was his signature erased. This is in the NLS. It's bound up with a copy of Jonson's other work, which was a kind of baronial counterpart to the History of the Kings, which celebrated the heroic deeds of the worthies of Scotland, essentially, which has got Drummond's signature on it. And it seems they've been, although the binding they're currently in is only 19th century, they seem to have been together for a long time and have come from a common source. So we can see them there sort of working together. So, such details testify that such materials were near to hand for Jonson, and perhaps also hint at Drummond's role in guiding or influencing his engagement with these other British histories. Johnston's work, Buchanan's Historia, and the certain matters in which the focus of Knesco is mirrored all contribute to a historiographical and chorographical perspective on the basis of which, in Roger Mason's words, the union of the Scottish and English crowns was to be seen not as a recreation of the empire of Brutus or Constantine or Arthur, but as the conjunction of two historic sovereign states. Given such tutelage, and Jonson's evidently contemporaneous alertness to the differences within the history and historiography of ancient Britain, it's far from impossible that the epic he was mulling over at his departure from Edinburgh did indeed turn on an audacious plan to effect a binational alignment of the differing perspectives of his country and this country, as Sibbald's generally careful and accurate transcript would suggest. In this connection, we might well wonder why Jonson subsequently requested that Drummond send him the oath which the old valiant knights of Scotland gave when they received the order of knighthood. No such work survives, however. None of the proposed poems or books mentioned to Drummond made it, were probably never written. If the notion of a binational epic seems attractive, even persuasive, and I freely confess that to me it does, it's perhaps for a couple of reasons, and I'll conclude with these. The first is that it makes sense in the context of the biogeography of Jonson's journey, not just the symbolic movement between two capitals, but the broader connotations of the fact of walking. To walk this road was to turn one's back, even if temporarily, on the metaphysics of union, with its obliteration of differences, its magical translations, its preference for topology over topography. To walk this road was to emphasize instead the biomechanics of union, the conjunction of two polities in the lives, circles and movements of all King James's subjects, shifting place and air, pacing out the sometimes difficult dimensions of this distinctively Jacobean proximity. And for the king's pensioned poet to come on foot, like a pilgrim, seeking hospitality, that he would walk 500 miles, almost, reintroduces the symbolism at another level and brings me to my second reason for finding this possibility alluring. The expenditure of energy and shoe leather, the pain and weariness endured, become a sign of Jonson's commitment to seeing the Union through Britain's other eye, rather than sitting in the Empire seat surveying the landscape with a monocular vision. Given my own biogeography and our current political moment, it would be hard for me not to respond to this. Thank you.
I'd like to join me again to thank James very much for his excellent lecture. I found that fascinating as a scientist by origin and a northerner and a southerner and then a northerner. I found that a fascinating account. So thank you very much, James. Thank you.
This production is brought to you by the University of Edinburgh.